where we're talking about the Newfoundland election. Now, Professor McKay, I want to ask you, what happens after this election is completed? Will there be grounds to challenge the result? And if there is a challenge, what happens then? Can the entire election be thrown out, or is it only in the polls where it's challenged? Do they need to do this whole thing all over again?
Lots of complicated questions, but let me start with the first one. I mean, I think the most likely challenge, apart from the whole jurisdiction and statute point we just talked about, is a charter challenge based on Section 3 guarantees under the Charter to democratic rights, and that includes the right to vote. And that has been interpreted in a number of cases as saying that means a meaningful right to vote. And as one part of meaningful, that it has to be a fairly equal opportunity or a relatively equal opportunity for everyone to have access. And there's so many indications that that isn't really necessarily happening in this case. So I think, and people have talked about that. I think various people have already suggested that there might be that kind of challenge. And on your other points, if it's unconstitutional, almost any of the remedies you suggested might be a possibility, including having another election.
Professor Powell, what's your take? What do you think the likelihood of a challenge of the result once this is all said and done?
There aren't actually that many cases challenging election results in Canada. Normally, there have been a few. There was the Opitz case at the Supreme Court. There was the robocalls case. In Newfoundland, there was one based on the special ballot procedures, the Mitchell case from 2011 election. So I think the likelihood is high. To me, Professor McKay absolutely right. Section 3 challenge, probably around the fact that you had to apply to get a special ballot, and that some people's some people voted early and those votes still count. Then some people were forced to apply for a ballot later if you plan to vote in person and then were not able to. So there are some inequalities within the group of people otherwise eligible to vote that I think will be subject to litigation, but only if the results are close. That's usually the way it works. If you think that, if someone wins by 10,000 votes, it's unlikely to be challenged because you probably won't find enough ballots to be able to change the result. But if we're in a Section 3 world, then it might be different. It may simply be the election is tainted, as Professor McKay suggested.
Yeah, and it certainly makes me concerned about it undermining public confidence in the result. But I want to ask you, Professor Powell, what precedent does this set for the rest of the country? We know there's the looming prospect of a federal election with any minority government constantly. So is there any concern about this situation playing out federally?
Any sensible person, I think, would look at the Newfoundland and Labrador election and say, we need to try to mitigate any risk of a similar scenario. This pandemic's gone on long enough. The idea that we can delay all elections as long as possible stops being feasible. So I'm sympathetic to legislatures or parliament or government if it's time to have an election, but we need to be prepared to have a mail-in voter in much higher numbers. You need to try to spread voters out, so make it easier to vote in advance and early. And one thing Newfoundland did well is there's a postmark deadline. So you have to mail in your ballot by a certain date rather than make sure it's received at the election offices by a certain date. If it has to be received by a certain date, then you're at the mercy of the Postal Service, which quite reasonably be delayed in an emergency.
That does sound like a good idea among many bad ideas that they seem to have had during this election. Thank you both so much for joining me. It's been a fascinating conversation.